checkpoint.
Yeah, I don't have any time. Yeah, no, they'll probably move around. I know John will probably move around a bit. More format. No talking we can record about it. Give me a chance to test it out. Yeah.
Oh, that's what I did. look at that. Let's do that. Dance function. I used to go look at that. And I think it was I need to know that. I don't know what that's. You can't go outside of it. They go whatever it is. We don't know that they're thinking of going to. Oh, back up. Morning. Morning. Circle. Back.
Let's get started. Let's have a conference, okay? Good morning. My name is John Mayer, and I'm the Executive Director of CALI, and I want to welcome you to the 15th Annual Conference for Law School Computing. Of course, it took a librarian to point out that there's an N missing in the word conference there. Sorry, Ken. Had to do that to you. Anyhow, I was looking through the list of people who are of the attendees, and I was surprised to see so many names I did not recognize, and delighted. And not to embarrass you folks, but do me a favor. Everybody who's never been to a conference, this is the first one, raise your hand and hold it up. Now keep it up there. Now everybody else who's around them, I want you to reach over and welcome them to the conference. Welcome to the conference. All right, now I don't want you all to be left out, so everybody who's ever been to a conference, raise your hand. Yes. And now I want you all to say to each other, welcome back to the conference. Great, thank you. All right, we've got some housekeeping stuff to take care of. And the first thing is, I need you to, if not turn off your cell phones, I know for some people that would be kind of hard, to put them in manner mode or something like that, because we want to make sure that you're not disturbing the... Crap. Hold on a second. Wait a minute, no way. Oh no. Whoa, no. All right, stop that. Oh, crap. Oh. Elmer, you there?
Yes, John.
Elmer, I'm having trouble with my computer. What should I do?
Change careers?
Elmer, help me.
Try the Linux disk, John.
You gotta be kidding, right?
No, of course not. I'm like a big Penguin fan.
Hold on a second. Be right with you. Oh. All right. Well, that was fast. Good. Oh, cool. All right. Oh, thank you. Yeah, sure. All right. Sorry about that. So don't forget to turn off your cell phones, or at least put them into manner mode, to not upset the speakers or things like that. All right. There are buses from the Hyatt to the Millennium Park, but frankly, it's a nice 3-4 block walk. So don't feel like, oh, I missed the bus, can't make the dinner, or anything like that. All right. Lunch today, lunch tomorrow, breakfast on Saturday are in 2 locations. On the second floor cafeteria, and it's set up so there'll be 2 lines, and then the 5th floor, room 580, and there'll be 2 lines. All right? Now, I know you all have trouble figuring out how to divide yourselves in half, so I've come up with this system. So I want all you red staters to go to the 2nd floor, and all you blue staters to go to the 5th floor. Is that clear? All right. Now, the program book, which you all got, might need a little bit of explanation for those of you who don't understand program books. It's got 3 tabs, right? 1 for each day. Each tab has within it, each tab has time breaks in between each of the sessions, all right? And so that carries over for every single day, so that if you want to look up a particular session, you just look within a particular set of blues, and it's all the sessions at that time on that day. Is that clear? Good. If we have any changes, we'll print them on a separate colored piece of paper, put them out by the registration desk, and we'll tell you where to slot them into that book. All right? Good. Great. So, our first speaker today is Professor Stephen Weber. Although when I called him that once, he said he had to look around. He wasn't sure who I was talking to. And so the reason I heard about Stephen is I read his book, The Success of Open Source. And I thought, somebody else has got this great idea that the idea of open source is more than just a software phenomenon. It's a knowledge aggregation and amplification phenomenon. It's something that can be applied to lots of different situations. And the obvious ones, even I would think to us, is law and education. Because law is a series of cases in which precedents are set and people take their information from that and build upon it. And they're very much like an open source manner. And education is the sharing of information from faculty to student and from student to student through various underground networks and things like that. It's very much like an open source thing. So I'd like to introduce Stephen Weber, Professor of Political Science at the University of Berkeley.
We're just going to switch here.
Yeah, you can need this.
Well, I must say I've never seen so many people have so much fun inside the law school. It's got to be a first. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. I love talking about the open source phenomenon. I love talking about it to people who know a little bit about it. And what I want to do today is just sort of ask this question and answer it. How big a phenomenon is this? Is it the opening shot in something of an economic revolution? So let me start by showing you something that most of you will probably remember.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. Created for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests of any contradictory force. Purification of the force is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will pay them with their own courage. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
So there it is. There are the words. Everybody remember when this was shown? This was the halftime of Super Bowl 1984 was only shown once. I mean, interesting. I showed this in a class of undergraduates. So you know you're getting old. When they said 1984, when was that? And none of them had ever seen this ad, but some of them had heard of it. So let's just step back a second and imagine for a moment that this was 1984, and I was saying to you, 20 years or 21 years in the future, there are two companies portrayed in that ad. One of those companies will be selling a proprietary piece of hardware linked to a proprietary piece of software and trying to prosecute companies like, say, Real Networks that was trying to put its own data on that device. The other company portrayed in that ad would have bet the store, essentially, on open source software, despite the fact that it still remains the largest filer of patents in the world, would have a general counsel who asks the strategy people around him, now tell me, what exactly can you afford not to give away? So which company would be which? Yeah, and this is what I think is interesting about open source software. It shakes up people's categories in ways that are sort of interesting and unpredictable, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. But first, I ought to have the academic moment of simply defining what I mean when I talk about an economic revolution, and why I think this is an interesting term to discuss in this context. And I think there's a very simple way of talking about this. Economic evolution is when you know what to do with what's in front of you, and revolution is when you don't. So if you imagine that Rick Van Winkle takes too many Ambien and falls asleep, say in 1750, and he knows what to do with this thing. He wakes up in 1850, he still knows what to do. The candle might look a little bit different. It might be made out of wax rather than whale oil or something. But he knows what to do. However, when he goes to sleep again and wakes up in 1950 and he sees that, he probably doesn't know what to do. That's the difference between economic evolution and economic revolution. If he goes to sleep in 1950 and wakes up in 1970 and sees that, he'll figure it out. He'll figure it out. So that's what I want to try to distinguish among today. This is the story about economic revolution connected to open source and lots of other phenomena that we've all heard kind of ad nauseum. And it goes like this. The world has created technology which makes it very cheap for people to connect. This creates all sorts of new communities of knowledge. all this wonderful human motivation that was left behind in the old days, whenever the old days were, are unleashed. And this creates a rapid burst of innovation everywhere on the planet all at once, and everything has changed. That was the business model for the dot-com era. And I guess it didn't work. This is a bridge too far. I don't believe it's that simple. I think what we want to try to do to understand the implications of open source for other areas of the economy and think about it more broadly, including legal education and other kinds of education, is to take a sort of step backwards and ask, what is this phenomenon that we've seen and have studied and is really incredibly interesting in the software world, teach us a little bit more broadly about how people collaborate. Call it the economics and sociology of collaboration. And those are the questions I want to ask that sort of get at that problem. And I'll talk to a couple of them this morning, for as long as I can. So let me start by simply differentiating, or making a differentiation that I think really gets lost too frequently in discussions and literature about open source, between three different kinds of collaborative economics. One I'm going to call sharing, one I'm going to call just volunteerism, and one is open source. And they're different, and they require different things, and they solve different problems. So one is just a very simple phenomenon. I call it the sharing economy. Very simple sort of economics here. If you have infinite free copies of something you own, the next copy is worth nothing to you, but it's worth something to someone else. So you might as well give it away. There's no real cost to giving away copies of, for example, your DNA, since DNA copies itself reasonably precisely. Unless, of course, you think that the children to whom you pass on that DNA might eat your lunch, and I'll come back to that later. Obviously, the digital technology revolution expands the sort of DNA logic to lots of other things. And it would make sense for people to kind of give it away in some fashion. Now, if we were living in a perfect market economy, you'd take all those infinite copies and you would sell them. You would sell them probably at a very small price, because the kind of competition you'd see in a market like this would drive that price down to zero. In fact, what we saw with Napster and Nutella and other such things is, the price really did go to zero. People shared. Did everyone share? Well, the myth about Napster was that everybody shared with everybody. In fact, the fact of Napster is that lots of people chose to free ride and to just take on the sharing behavior of others. That was easy to do. The default position in Napster was your files would be open to the world, but lots of people didn't do that. And in fact, there's a very interesting paper, if you haven't seen, by Bernardo Huberman at Xerox PARC, called Free Riding on Nutella, which actually looks at the degree to which people chose to free ride. And, substantially, they did. What's interesting about this is that for some people, it was conceptualized as a kind of a trade. When they asked themselves, do I open my music to others so that they can have it as well? People saw it as a trade. Like, okay, so I'm going to open my files to you so that I can have copies of your stuff. It really wasn't a trade, because you could free ride. You could take from others without giving anything back in return. So what's interesting here? Well, what's interesting here, I think, is not that people didn't free ride. They did. But that free riding just didn't matter very much. And this is similar to an argument I made about software code. In fact, you know as well as I do that most people who use open source code do free ride on it, in the sense that they don't contribute much, or in most cases really anything, back to the community. And the point is, that's just fine. It really doesn't matter, right? So what's interesting about this? I think what's interesting is that there's not some powerful new insight about human motivation here. I don't think people who work in the open source world are somehow better or more noble than humans who work at Microsoft. They just live in a technological and social and economic environment where the economic requirements of sharing are less burdensome. And that's a really good thing. Not that many people have to share in order to create something of very significant value. Some do, Others can free ride. It doesn't matter. Might matter in an emotional sense. Some people might feel like they are getting cheated. And there might be a competitive constraint as well if, in fact, the people with whom you share, in some sense or at some point in the process of your relationship with them, can eat your lunch or damage you in some way. I'm going to come back to that because those are really important constraints. Those are the constraints that I think actually lie behind the need that Richard Stallman understood so well to have something like a general public license, the GPL. The GPL basically says any improvements that you make, you have to share back with the community. It's a leveling phenomenon. It says, on the basis of this stuff we're going to share, nobody can get out ahead by climbing on the joint contributions. And that's what keeps this vibrant. Okay, let me talk about the volunteerism economy. Separate and a very different kind of story. And you see a lot of this in the world as well. I think of this as kind of high-tech barn raising. Everybody gets together. We can lift a piece of wood that's heavier than any of us could lift on our own. Nothing to stop people from doing this. They get some psychic reward from helping other people have or solve a problem that they have. They take some pride in that. They feel good about it. The question is the whole necessarily greater than the sum of the parts? Do you really want to have a voluntarist knowledge-sharing economy everywhere in the world? I think the answer to that question is often, surprisingly, no. And here's what I mean by this. The problem about the voluntarist economy is not incentivizing people to make contributions. Why is there no collective poetry in the world? That's why there's no collective poetry in the world. Because that is not a poem. That is a language commons. That is a situation where I ask people to contribute words. Well, it's not hard. People contribute words. It's not hard to incentivize that contribution. This is what you get. And that's not a poem. That's just nonsense. In fact, it's garbage, right? If you think about like an uncoordinated, ungoverned donation truck that goes around and takes everyone's spare books out of their houses in Berkeley, you will get a library, but it's not going to be a very good library. It'll be a library in a defined sense, but it's not really going to be a very useful library. If you did the same thing with source code, if you just let anybody contribute anything they wanted to and mix it all together, you would have garbage. It wouldn't all work together. It wouldn't be useful. The point to say here is, look, governance is an issue, and it's often left out of the discussion. I think it's the critical issue around open source. How do you govern the contributions that people want to make? How do you decide what gets pulled into what is considered to be the core knowledge base, the core code base? And that's going to be true in almost any kind of open source economy, in almost any sector of what human beings do. You know, people often talk about Wikipedia as being an example of a kind of big open source style collaboration of lots of human beings contributing what they know on a sort of open and free basis. And let me just ask you the question. You know, Wikipedia is kind of fun, and I use it sometimes. Would you trust it to help you decide how to treat your child's leukemia? I don't think I would. Simply because this kind of undirected evolution that occurs in these voluntary systems, I mean, it's interesting. It might even work in the long run, but, you know, evolution is very messy. It leaves lots of roadkill. Most information that gets created is wrong, and most mutations are deadly, and most of us don't want to live in the primordial soup when it comes to things that really matter to us. And I think that that's true of much of the knowledge economy that we're playing in. So I think the issue here is actually, how do we govern distributed innovation, whether it's voluntary or otherwise? How do we govern distributed innovation? And that's a hard problem. It's hard in part because of something that the software folks understand terribly well, and it's known as Brooks' Law. Is everyone familiar with the derivation of why this is called Brooks' Law? All right, so this comes from a guy named Frederick Brooks, who was a programmer, actually a program manager at IBM in the 1960s, wrote a great book, which is still a fantastic read, called The Mythical Man Month, which tells you why it is that the man month idea for a software project is mythical. He coined, or he is credited with this law, much like Moore's law, I guess, which says as you raise the number of programmers on a project, the work that gets done scales linearly, but the complications and the problems scale geometrically. And I've always thought of this as an this is not about, to me, only about software code. I think this is an incredibly insightful statement about how complicated and hard it is for human beings to talk to each other about really complex ideas. And this is why lawyers talk slowly. Right? This is why it's really hard for groups of people to understand each other. This is why one-to-one, face-to-face communication still matters. This is really hard to explain to people complicated. It's hard to get complex ideas to work together. And that is the story of open source. Somehow, the open source community, not always consciously, and sometimes in spite of themselves, have figured out a way, or have landed upon a way, to manage the worst consequences of Brooks' Law. Or maybe even supersede it in some fashion. I think that's probably overstated. But they have created a world in which Brooks' Law doesn't constrain innovation as much as it does in the proprietary world. That's a big deal. And here's how it works. Well, how does it work? Actually. You know, it's really interesting. Over the last couple of years, as I've been talking about this stuff to people, I get this sense that, that open source has become a kind of Rorschach test for the internet, where people see in it what they want to see in it. And so you ask people, what do you think of when you think of open source? Some folks say, well, you know, I see a bunch of long-haired geeks writing code for other long-haired geeks, and it's no use to anyone really outside of a back-office data center where there are other long-haired geeks. And then you see people who say, well, it's an incredible it's a perfect meritocracy where the only thing that matters is how good you are. Anyone can rise to the level of their intelligence, regardless of their age, nationality, wealth, status, whatever. And then somebody else says, it's an economic trick played by IBM on Microsoft. Because what it is a way of turning into a commodity something that your competitor believes is their differentiating competitive asset. Great. And some people think it's just this kind of libertarian free-for-all where the only rules are the ones that Linus Torvalds and his friends can come up with. And that's sort of interesting. And some people think this is just a kind of a modern-day gift economy, where a lot of rich people, and many of the open source developers I know are not exactly rich, rich people give away gifts to each other like movie executives do in Hollywood because they're so wealthy that that's the symbol of status in them. So we give away gifts to each other to prove how important we are in the world. Like most complex phenomena, open source is a little bit of all of those things. And it's more. But you know, those are descriptions. They're not really explanations of how it works. And what I'm interested in, and I think people who think interestingly about how to apply some of the principles of collaboration in this community to other parts of their lives and other parts of the world in which we live need to try to understand is, how does the thing work? Why does open source code get better over time, not worse? You know, why is the whole more than the sum of its parts? Why isn't it collective poetry? And I think that's the important question to ask. Let me at least try to provoke you with a couple of ideas about this. 4 propositions. The first is that, despite what people say frequently, this is not a solution to a traditional commons problem. Second is, there's no battle out there between open and closed systems, and in fact, we don't want there to be. The third is figuring out what part of what you want to do ought to be in an open ecology and what part ought to be in a more closed ecology is the key to getting it right. And I would say, you know, that's true for companies, countries, even more. It doesn't matter. That's the kind of big rule of the new economy. And if we figure it out, we're going to be in a very good place. All right, so let me say a couple of things about each of those in the time I have, and not take too long, and then go on. Okay, so you remember this issue of the commons. Garrett Hardin writes this article Actually, a rather small article, kind of obscure. It appeared in, actually it's a good trivia question. Where did the article Tragedy of the Commons appear? It was in the Science magazine in 1968. And it was about overpopulation, actually. But now it's become such a sort of mainstream, it's almost inculcated in people's brains. So you hear commons and what do you think? Tragedy. The tragedy of the commons. Right? And it supposedly sets out this problem that everybody has to solve. What's the problem? Is it the same problem that software communities or open source communities have to solve? That's a question I want to ask. Okay, so what Hardin is doing is writing about the problem of overpopulation. Why is the world becoming, remember in 1968 the world was becoming overpopulated. Why is the world becoming overpopulated? He used the example of overgrazing to illustrate the logic. He said, look, if you have this ranch, a bunch of ranchers, and there's a place where their cows graze, and that land is held in common, then each rancher will have too many cows because they don't bear the full cost of what the cows do to the grazing lands. And so the pasture becomes overgrazed, and everybody ends up much worse off than they should have been. Now look at the nature of the problem here. The problem is overuse. God or someone like that gave you a pasture. The pasture has a finite carrying capacity. And the problem Hardin is saying, if that is owned in common, it will get overused to the point where it's no longer useful. In other words, what Hardin is saying, here's a problem where the resource is already in place. And my concern is that it's going to get used up. But that's not the problem when it comes to software. Right? Software is a digital good. It's non-rival, if we choose to make it that way. And so, you can't really overuse software. You can't diminish the availability of software for others. Arguably, because of network effects, it's sort of exactly the opposite. The more people grazing on the software commons, the better. The problem here is actually different. The problem is that we don't create enough of it. The problem is creating software in the first place. God didn't give us the commons. We have to make it. And even worse, we've got to maintain it and upgrade it and evolve it and sustain it over time. I like to think of this as a very nasty phrase, but as a kind of constructed commons. Something we have to build together. Before we even worry about who uses it and how they use it, we've got to ask the question of how does it come to be in the first place? That's, if there's a tragedy, that's what it is. It's not about overuse. It's about under-provision. There's just not enough high-quality global digital infrastructure in the world. And that's not because people use too much of it, it's because people don't make enough of it. That's a different kind of problem. How does it get solved? Well, Hardin had a simple set of solutions. He believed that there were sort of crystal clear private incentives. You either create the Leviathan, which is Hobbes' notion of the state, which then allocates the commons to different pieces by rules to different pieces of ranches, or you privatize it. You split it up and you give everyone their own little proprietary piece of land, and then people's incentives are correctly aligned. Very simple ideas. Hardin didn't develop them. They have long roots in political philosophy. They have huge consequences for the way people think about the economy and the creation of goods. Right? Just, go to the World Bank. Listen to what people say about Hernando de Soto, who believes that the trick to developing economies is essentially to privatize land titles. Do that and people will create wealth. Listen to President Bush talk about the ownership society. It all goes back to the same sort of logic. Right? Align property rights clearly with individuals, you get productive economic action. Larry Summers has a habit of saying things that he really shouldn't say, but sometimes he says smart things. He once said, nobody in the world ever washed a rented car. And that's the argument. Right? Of course, what he's not saying is that lots of people don't wash the cars they own either. Lots of people don't change the oil. And sometimes, actually, neighbors will help you wash your car because they're kind of being friendly. Or everybody in the neighborhood might agree that, if we all wash our cars a little bit more frequently, the neighborhood's going to look better. And this is the sort of stuff Eleanor Ostrom was looking at when she went out and wrote this book called Governing the Commons, if you're familiar with that sort of book. We also know that those kinds of solutions are context-dependent, They tend to be sort of fragile. You know, when you get really busy, you don't pay attention to the norms, you don't wash your car. And so these kinds of solutions can be a little bit fragile. I don't think they apply to the digital infrastructure, again, because the problem is not overuse. It's under provision. And so, how do we do it? How do we solve this problem for the digital infrastructure? Well, we haven't had great models for doing this, actually. We haven't had great models for doing this. Governments, actually, even just think about it in the physical world, governments often build and pay for infrastructure by taxing their populations. Sometimes they undertax. There's a version of Leviathan that you can imagine here. They don't always manage those tax revenues terribly well. They use it to pay for bridges and roads. And you'd have to argue, looking at the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, and looking at the state of our physical infrastructure, that maybe this isn't the best solution. And I'm not sure anyone in this room would want, say, the U.S. government to monopolize or nationalize the software industry, or create out of Microsoft an AT&T-style regulated monopoly. Well, maybe I should ask. Anybody here want us to do that? Want the government to do it? Okay, there's no votes for that, so let's move on. There's another way to do it, of course, and that's called, by economists, greater fool, which means you, not me. Dispossessing bondholders who buy bonds or equity shares, sometimes equity stock, in commoditizing infrastructure. So think of, for example, of the poor British financiers who found themselves with U.S. railroad bonds in 1870. Or the poor Americans who bought shares of JDSU in 1997. Or Corning. Or so on and so forth. Right? This is kind of greater fool mechanism for the public provision of private goods. It works. It actually does work. It's what I would argue not socially optimal. And it's probably actually going to get harder because presumably people get a little bit smarter. And there is a lot more transparency about what's going on. So I think that's not the greatest solution. This is what the open source folks have done. And of course, this is just a quick reminder of what makes open source what it is. This is one version of the sort of classic open source definition. It tells you a little bit about the innovation ecology. I want to think that I sort of want to summarize at least my view of what's happening here and what these folks have done and why it works. And again, I want to emphasize that this was not a conscious design. But this community has found a very compelling model for the private provision of public goods that works over time. 3 points about it. First is just a very simple move from what is an almost intuitive notion of what constitutes property in a modern economy. The notion that having property in something gives you the right to set the rules around how others will be excluded from it, or under what terms they will be excluded from it. And in sort of very simple term, property, the notion of property is built around the concept of exclusion. Open source essentially flipped that on its head and said, in this community, we're going to treat property as a set of rights around distribution. And so the notion of ownership becomes the right to distribute, not the right to exclude. And to distribute under the condition that really the only constraint that you can put on that distribution is that others can't do things that would prevent others from doing the same kind of distribution with it. And that's kind of revolutionary. At least it's a basis for experimenting with a different kind of political economy. What I'm doing here is actually not talking about transaction costs, the way economists, business people did in the late 1990s. The open source community messed around with it. They used lower transaction costs of the internet like everybody did, but they used it to mess around with the concept of property rights, to juggle, the other part of the Coase theorem, if you're into that stuff, to experiment with a new notion of property rights. And that, I think, is a much more profound shock in the system. It's about how people own pieces of knowledge. And that has placed a great challenge over the idea that the way in which we build software or other complex knowledge goods ought to be just like the way in which we build cars. Because in effect, that's how it's been done for a very long time. Which is why I say the Fordist industrial paradigm. Think about how we build software. You treat it like a complicated industrial good. Right? You organize production inside of a company. You divide up the labor in a formal way. You outsource pieces of that product to different teams. Now, maybe some of them are in India or China. Right? You coordinate the whole thing through a corporate hierarchy. You try to minimize principal-agent problems, and you keep the source code secret, because that's what yields your competitive advantage. This is Fordism for knowledge goods. Nothing wrong with that. The question we are asking in an experimental way as we move through this open source versus proprietary discussion, is it inevitable? Is this the best way to make complex knowledge goods? Is it the only way to make complex knowledge goods? I would say that the piece of evidence to sort of bring to bear on that question, the success of open source in competitive marketplaces at least suggests that this is not the only way to do it. That Fordism is not the only way to do it. Let me put on the table a historical analogy. I think it's useful to contextualize this, and I hope will stick in people's minds. Carry you back to 1985 or so and ask, for people like myself who sort of studied industrial organization, what did you see? What did people see when they went to the Toyota factory in Japan? They saw no inventory. They saw suppliers located close to the factory. They saw sharing of designs. They saw very little fix-it space at the end of the line. Workers that could shut down the assembly line at any... I mean, they saw these weird things going on inside the production process. What they focused on, what everyone was sort of paying attention to, was the car. They fetishized the car, right? That was what they fixated on the car because the car was taking away market share. At the end of the 1980s, a bunch of researchers from MIT wrote a very important book called The Machine That Changed the World. The message of that book was, the machine that changed the world is not a machine. It's not a car. It's a way of making cars. Right? It sounds an incredibly simple thing, but it was a very powerful insight. Toyota is not an artifact. Stop fetishizing the commodity. That went out with 1850s Marxists. Look at the way in which the thing is made. Right? It was about something called lean production that could revolutionize industries across a wide swath of the economy. And to do this, to make this argument, they had to break down a series of bad narratives that were out there in the literature and, frankly, out there in the newspapers about lean production. People said, it's a kind of technology and it only works for cars. And people said, it's cultural. You can only do this if you're Japanese. Because it's absolutely linked to calisthenics at 6 in the morning in front of the factory. I mean, this is serious. And then, of course, there were some extremely sophisticated scholars and academics who said, it's magic. And it only works for Toyota. And just think about what you see in the open source world. This is software. No other sector of the economy makes sense to think about these kinds of things. And it's basically hackers writing codes for other hackers, and it's a cultural phenomenon, and it can't really work anywhere else. And Linus Torvald is a magician. Well, I think I've sort of laid out at least the beginning of a model, a simple model for organized open systems, and told you about how they might work. This notion of property is the right to distribute. I want to just quickly mention the question of what I think of as micro motives, why it is that people contribute to these jobs. I don't think this is actually, once you've spent time in a community that works this way, I don't think it's actually a tremendous puzzle. I think there's a lot of reasons why people contribute code to open source projects. There's also even some research on this. But again, I don't think you needed to be terribly insightful to discover this. Only very good economists find it surprising that human beings will occasionally do things for non-monetary reasons. For the rest of us, we sort of take it for granted that most of human life is actually in a non-monetized world. Yeah, we have to make enough money to live. But we do things because we like it. We do things because we learn from it. We do things because we want to share with other people. And we do things in part because we want to create a reputation for doing things well that in some circumstances you might be able to monetize. You might be able to get a higher paying job, but also because you want to be able to interact with other people who do things well, and reputation is a very good way to do that. So if you want to show people how good you are at writing code, or presumably anything else, why would you want to keep the code secret? In fact, if you want people to see that you're not just good, but excellent, you would like to make the whole process open to others. And in fact, that's why people do it. And finally, we have this argument that I've sort of suggested about how it is that all this stuff comes together to work effectively. I call it parallel distributed innovation, costly exclusion from cooperation. I mean, these are sort of economics terms. Basically, as I said, you don't want the language commons. This is why I think Eric Raymond was really only half right when he made this very famous comment, with enough eyes, all bugs are shallow. That's not always true. It totally depends on how the eyes are organized. Right? And the organizational genius was to create a system of parallel distributed innovation where lots of people can try out different solutions to problems in parallel to each other, where you take away the central decision maker in the sense that no one actually decides for others what they ought to do or what they ought not to do. And so innovation is incentivized out at the edges, and it gets incorporated into the center in the case that improves the performance of the whole. Otherwise it goes away, unless someone else can use it for another purpose. That's a pretty efficient innovation ecology. And if you're part of that innovation ecology, you want to stay part of that innovation ecology. Because in a very significant way, right, the worst sanction that the open source community can place on you is to exclude you from the benefits of that sharing knowledge. And if you break the rules, you risk ending up in that place. A couple lessons about how this applies to broader sectors of the economy that I think are quite useful to keep in mind when we think about open source principles elsewhere. Simple statements, sort of observations about why the open source community works as well as it does, or not as unbadly as it does, which is about the same thing. GPL is not just a license. It's a statement about the kind of a community that you're joining when you play in this game. It says, if you choose to join this community, we have to have you agree to these principles so others can't exploit you. It's actually remarkably skeptical of human nature. The GPL doesn't say everybody is good and everybody will share and everyone will act responsibly towards the shared product. BSD-style licenses say that. They say you can do whatever you want. The GPL says, in order to play in our world, you have to agree to these terms. Because if you don't, someone might try to exploit you, which is a sort of backhanded way of you might try to exploit someone else. It's actually rather kind of skeptical. It feels that you need to be forced to be free. That's okay. It works. Second principle. There's a clear expectation floating around that if you break the rules, you'll pay. And if you pay, that means you will be shunned. And if you're shunned, that means that you are now left out in the world by yourself, the cold, cruel world, trying to solve a problem on your own that other people are working together to solve. That's actually a rather effective constraint, a rather effective cost to someone who is trying to compete with that joint product. Third thing that the open source community does, not always terribly well, but better than some others, they engage in constant communication in public spaces. I think this is actually very, very important. Despite the fact that Oscar Wilde said socialism takes too many evenings, and I think he was right, the open source community seems to have a profound abundance of evenings, in the sense that people talk a lot about the decisions that they make. And those conversations, as you know, I mean, it's wonderful for social science researcher wanting to look at this, because basically all the evidence you need about the community's politics is sitting out there on the web for you to read. It also plays a very important role for the community in itself, because the constant public communication and the archiving of those communications creates constraints on just how nasty people can be to each other. You know, you see this. You see fights happening in the open source community. You see it online. But at a certain point, people recognize that they are responsible for what they are saying because it's being archived. and others are listening. And because they're operating in a thin bandwidth environment, in other words, they're not in a bar and they can't punch each other, they're actually just using words to argue online, ultimately there's a kind of self-regulating dynamic that goes on there, and the fight starts to wind down. People get focused on the problem again. And finally, and I think this is really important, there are no black holes. You know, the times that the open source community has really gotten into trouble, at least the Linux community has gotten into trouble in particular, is when patches, problems, solutions started getting dropped on the floor. When, because of the press of business, or because people were overwhelmed, or things got too messy, or whatever, stuff got forgotten. And volunteers felt like their work was being ignored. There's a big difference between being told, we don't want to use this piece of code, and here's why. And it's been 3 months, I haven't heard anything about what I submitted as a patch. One of those is extraordinarily demotivating and breaks the system. The other only might, and that's the difference. Okay. Let me, I'm running out of time and I want to keep the schedule, so let me just take 2 more minutes to talk about what I think is not happening in the world and why we don't want it to happen. There's an image out there about what happens when open source systems come into contact with proprietary systems in the marketplace. And the image is one of a massive battle, okay? A struggle to the death. And this is the way people talk about it in the media increasingly, and I think it's a very bad thing. You know, it's David and Goliath. It's Larry Lessig versus Jack Valenti and Michael Eisner. This is not Jack Valenti anymore. It's Glickman, Ron Glickman. It's One World Health versus Pfizer and Merck. And the big bad media companies versus KPFA, you know, the Berkeley leftist local radio. Okay? And so, but this is wrong. And both sides are guilty, actually, of creating this image. Plenty of blame to go around. You know, if you talk to people at Pfizer, they will tell you, oh, if anyone, anywhere, is allowed to experiment with a different property rights scheme around a major therapeutic molecule, one experiment and the entire pharmaceutical sector will come crashing down and there will never be a new drug. You know? And the folks at Creative Commons, again, doing incredibly great work, but sometimes they sound as if, you know, one peer-to-peer network is shut down because it induces copyright infringement, then people will stop making art. And the growth of culture will come to a screeching halt. This is not a good debate to be having. It's a great image. It sells books. Okay? But it's wrong. And it's ultimately self-defeating. And here's why I think it's wrong and ultimately self-defeating. And let me end with this point, because I'm going on too long. Imagine that this turns into a black versus white battle. Who wins? Who wins? So, you know, let me just use the Cinderella Man imagery for a minute. In this corner of the boxing ring, we have some of the richest corporations in the world with extraordinary political influence. You know, the folks at Pfizer unabashedly say, we own the U.S. Congress. And, in fact, they do. They have, working for them, an army of the highest paid lawyers, and they have cleanly articulated economic models that actually do justify their conception of property rights. In this other corner, we have a kind of ragtag collection of scrappy public interest lawyers who are funded by foundations, talking in abstract and vague terms about a world that could be. So who wins? Not who do you want to win. Who actually wins? And the point is, you know, we don't want either side to win. We actually don't want either side to win. And the reason we don't want either side to win, I think, is because intuitively, the really vibrant innovation ecologies, exist at the edges, at the mixture of open and closed spaces. Think of New York City for a minute. You know, Central Park is open. Most of the exclusive apartments on Central Park West are closed, except, on the day of an open house. What would New York City be like if the whole city were Central Park? What would New York City be like if there were no Central Park? And neither of those cities is a city you want to live in. Okay? And so I think it's worth noticing, and I think I'll finish up with this point. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, when you go to New York, the most interesting neighborhoods are those that sit at the boundary, right at the edges, right, between open and closed spaces. Central Park West, Fifth Avenue North, places like, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's where the real challenge and the real innovation happens. So why don't we get ourselves back on time, and I'll stop there. I have a few minutes for questions.
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks, John. I have time for one.
Questions?
Please.
Who do you see as the gatekeeper between the hive mentality of living creation and the capitalism mentality of, where does the creative stuff, where's the room for creativity if you have a hive mentality or, I'm a real strong supporter of Linux, but you have the hive mentality and ultimately the bad side, the Borg mentality, and then you have the creative stuff. Who's watching over that?
Yeah.
We don't ultimately govern our. We don't have this master rhythm.
Yeah. Or as they like to say, what happens when Linus gets hit by a bus? Well, Linus is asked by accident. A bus that says Microsoft on the side. No, we're not responsible for that. A bus that says SCO and Microsoft on the side. Yeah. No, so I think that this is a question that I actually think the open source community has sufficiently institutionalized its governance principles so it doesn't depend on Linus anymore. I think he could go away. In fact, in a significant way, he has gone away. Much of what he used to do is now done by people beneath him in a rather well-articulated hierarchy, actually, that is really, kind of complicated and concrete decision-making structure. So it's not an anarchy and it's not a bazaar. What it is voluntary. And anybody who wants to step outside, look, as some of my friends have noted to me, when I've said the following, you think you can do a better job than Linus? Go up and create Steve Weber Linux. And in fact, you can call it Swinix or Swinix, and you can have a pig as a mascot. Thank you. And for some reason, it's never worked. And the reason it's never worked is because ultimately I can't do as good of a job as Linus. But someone will come along soon, I suspect, who can do a better job than Linus. And Linux will be broken up, and the pieces will be used to create something else. And everyone will be terribly upset about this for a while. And then a few years later, we'll look back and say, wow, that was a critical move. It was a critical move in driving the innovation to the next level. That's the way open source style or open system evolutionary processes work. And it is a very good thing. The question of whether or not that can be crushed by proprietary interests. See, I try not to accept the kind of hive versus Borg mentality for exactly the reasons that I just said. I don't want that battle to happen because I think if it happens, if it really happens, we lose it. I do believe there's a role for government in making sure that the battle goes on. And I don't think it's a place necessarily to get into a long conversation about government policies around open source procurement and whether or not governments, both in the United States and in the developing world, what's happening much more frequently, should mandate the use of open source software and stuff like that. But I think the general motivation behind that ought to be not must favor open source, but must make sure the battle goes on.
Another question? Comment? Stunned. That was actually the question I was going to ask. Should governments mandate, or how much should they interfere in this economic space? You know, in the United States, you can say,
Yeah.
you know, pure capitalism is fine for consign in Brazil or India
Yeah.
or up and coming countries. You say, well, they don't have enough money to pay Microsoft tax. Maybe they should.
Maybe they shouldn't, yeah. And in fact, many of them are playing on the edges of this. You know, this is funny. I mean, what I'm about to say actually makes me a radical right-wing conservative in the town in which I live. And so that, I don't actually see the case for mandated government procurement. As I said, I think open source is a vibrant enough way of making things. And I think that if given the chance, let me take a step back. If no one is able to block open source from entering the marketplace on equal terms, then it will do just fine on its own. And so my view is the role of government actually ought to be to make sure that the playing field is there. I don't even think it actually, to tell you the truth, needs to be absolutely level. I just think it needs to be there. And so as long as governments are able to be certain that the open source movement can't be crushed, which they could do. I mean, it would be incredibly easy. You could tie up the open source community in litigation for 4 or 5 years, and it would probably sap most of the energy. Because these guys, you know, people working in this community, they don't want to talk to lawyers. They want to write code. And if Microsoft chose to do so, it could bring a series of patent lawsuits for infringement against the open source community that would keep everyone busy being deposed for the next 3 to 4 years, and probably sap a lot of the creative energy out of the organization. They won't do that, I think, because I remember a couple of months ago, IBM made this announcement. We were making this grant of 500 patents open. I mean, the underlying motivation for this, in case it's not obvious, was it was essentially a threat to Microsoft, saying, okay, look, we're in a mutually assured destruction situation here. And guess what? You know, you guys, software code's promiscuous. Yeah, you could probably tie up the open source community for years in a patent battle. But guess what? If you do that, we're going to arm the open source community with our patents, and they're going to come right back at you. And then the next 5 years of software development will be spent in the courts rather than in front of the computers, and everyone will be hurt. And I think the underlying view behind that is that the wind is, this is like the Cold War in 1985. Things are going in our direction. As long as the other side doesn't launch the nuclear strike, we'll be okay because things are going in the right direction. And so what we need is a good deterrent threat. And so that's my view of government policy in this place is very limited. I think if governments get deeply involved in trying to mandate the procurement of open source, it creates a political target against which the proprietary, the incumbents, can push back on really, really, really hard. And I don't think that's good.
You have a question? Last one? You made my point already. No. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Scheduled a half hour to the next section.
I didn't want to. Don't be an academic when they say stop the time. Stop the time.
If I don't see walk for about that's about a half mile right on the other side. But if at Millennium Park, it's about south of your hotel and 2 blocks east of mine.
Nice. How are you?
But if I go back to the hotel, otherwise I go there. If you walk from here, I'll walk over to the top of my head. Yeah, you should come back to
Very easy. Everything works. John's got the,
So go on.
Yeah.
John's got the system down.
But you've only got to get it off.
That'll work.
But it does display this perfectly.
Oh, yeah.
You want to check at some
I'm
point.
going to go training tomorrow morning, and then I'll probably be done. I'll probably be done on Friday.